Consciousness raising led to action, which led to change. Women encountered resistance at every step. But like the suffragists, the first wave of the women's movement, this second wave turned into a tsunami whose effects are still being felt. It remains to be seen if a third wave will carry on.
It's not an easy time, but we can't afford to say it doesn't matter or to give up.
The 1960s were a time of great turmoil, unrest, and social change. The civil rights movement heated up. Protest against the Vietnam War spread. Fashion and music were revolutionized. Everything was in flux. Out of the turbulence, the women's movement was coming into its own. It would mobilize women across the country who demanded their rights and that their voices be heard. Michigan was not immune to this sea change. Its women were major players in what's called the second wave of the women's movement.
I think that coming out of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, there was a tremendous sense of possibility, that you could make change, that you could affect public policy, that you could affect politics in a way that would be beneficial.
The exciting thing about the women's movement is that change occurred while you were working on it, and that was the thrilling to and exciting and it motivated you to go forward.
Anytime you are involved in a movement to change the status quo, it really is an empowering feeling, even if you're not always successful, that there is, a small group of people who can change the world.
The world has changed, and that has come about because of hard-fought principles that at the time were very difficult. It took great courage for women, as well as like-minded men that put that into place, and now we see opportunities opening.
I know that there are a lot of people who say, well, feminism is a thing of the past. We don't need it anymore. So it's up to us to help the next wave understand that yes, it is important. There are always battles that need to be fought.
You have to organize, you have to use your collective strength, you have to strategize, you have to follow through, and you have to be patient and have a lot of endurance.
The suffragists of the first wave of the women's movement had lots of patience and endured. They didn't win the right to vote until 1920, 72 years after their quest began. The second wave used their votes to elect women and make other lasting changes. In the spring of 2005, a group of Michigan's veteran feminists from the second wave reunited to plan a film so young women would appreciate their history and the work that secured the rights so many take for granted today.
There are so many young women now who feel that the accomplishments that we made is the way it always has been.
That's right, and will be.
Yeah.
Right, and will be.
Well, they don't realize what we had to go through in order to get them.
And we need to talk about it.
They knew they couldn't tell their complete story. There were too many women and too many issues. But they hoped this glimpse into history would show why things happened.
I think a lot of it came from altruism, a belief that things should be better, inner force that told a lot of us that we had to make things right.
Education, childcare, domestic violence, employment, rape, sexual orientation, poverty, credit, reproductive rights. Everywhere they looked, there was a need to change minds and attitudes.
Now, I can tell you, men who used to talk about me so terribly until they had to put their daughters through school, paid $50,000 for an education, I got more converts from reality. It was reality that converted a lot of men.
Their meeting was an opportunity to reminisce, reflect, and think about the changes they'd made and what remained to be done, and to remember how they'd changed.
Do you remember who it was speaking?
It's me.
Oh, it's you! Oh my gosh! Oh,
Yes, back in the red glasses
fabulous.
day.
It's great.
Before we did our, walk down to the
Now,
Capitol.
the platform chairs have come back.
Yeah, they have.
They had inherited a legacy from women activists in Michigan that they built upon. Michigan women who were active in the early labor struggles planted the seeds for the women's movement. During the Flint sit-down strike in 1939, the Women's Brigade helped bring General Motors to the bargaining table and pave the way for the United Auto Workers to ultimately represent millions of Americans. Women stayed active in the labor movement and learned to organize. They also discovered the power of collective action. During World War II, Michigan women entered the plants and took their place on the assembly lines, replacing the men who went off to war. Rosie the Riveter was on the front lines in Detroit's auto factories as they became the arsenal of democracy. Things changed when the war ended. Women were expected to go home, and the men returned to claim their jobs.
A lot of labor union women didn't go home. They stayed and they organized. And the United Auto Workers had a women's department from the 1930s on. They have had a women's department. They have always been concerned about issues related to working women.
UAW President Walter Reuther nurtured the growth and development of the women's movement in Michigan.
From the very beginning, Walter's concept of unionism extended to total community involvement and was done on the basis of equity for all persons. And certainly that there be elimination of any kind of bigotry, whether it be anti-Semitism, racial, and all discrimination.
With Reuther's support, Dorothy Hayner and Caroline Davis from the UAW helped found the National Organization for Women, NOW, in 1966.
The first NOW office was actually at UAW headquarters in Solidarity House. They were so helpful because they understood the need for women to pull together and organize and advocate for themselves.
NOW chapters began to spring up around the country. Michigan NOW was launched in 1969. Noted portrait artist Patricia Hill Burnett, a former Miss Michigan and runner-up for Miss America, helped found Michigan NOW.
One day I was driving along with a friend of mine, and we were talking about how we weren't so happy with our husbands at all, and what we could do about it. And we said, let's call Betty Friedan and see if we could start a NOW chapter in Michigan.
That was our entire discussion. So she said, well, since I brought it up, I'll be president. I said, okay, I'll be vice president.
They held their first NOW meeting in Detroit's elite professional artist enclave, the Scarab Club.
The delicious thing is that it was purely a man's club, and I was the first one to have a studio there. And they were rather horrified to find out that we started this radical feminist movement in their club. Come if they let me out.
Burnett's charm eventually won them over. She didn't fit the feminist stereotype most people expected.
They're made so beautifully.
She was just an outstanding, warm, beautiful woman who, it turned out, of course, she was Miss Congeniality, I forgot, when she was Miss Michigan, was a wonderful contrast to the image of the bra-burning feminist. Actually, we were all called women's livers.
We started having rap sessions, and women would come in with bruises all over them. One came in with a broken arm, and one came in with 2 of her front teeth missing. who were really abused women, who talked about what they were living through.
Out of the consciousness raising sessions, we had a lot of women come who were abused. And amazingly, this was 1970, there were no safe houses.
I decided to join now and to be a part of this task force that was dealing with the issues of violence against women. There was no place for anybody to go. And initially with the task force, we were trying to find places that would be suitable, alternatives for women.
They convinced the YWCA in downtown Detroit to change its focus from serving as a residence for young women moving to the city to providing a safe house for battered women and their children. Police attitudes toward domestic violence also had to change.
What needed to be changed was the attitude that indeed there was a victim. We had to teach them how to listen to this. We had to teach them how to indicate which was telling the truth. If the man's knuckles were bruised, then we could tell that violence had taken place. Those are things that they never looked at before. And this, in Detroit, was one of the first of the places that there was training taking place.
Domestic violence affected women throughout the state. Burnett was appointed to the Michigan Women's Commission and launched a fact-finding study on domestic violence. It revealed that it was a statewide issue. Burnett's passion for women's issues helped create a climate for change.
It took the women's movement, I think, for me to realize how, well, that we're truly all sisters. We have all the same problems in any nation, in any race, any language. We really do have the same problems and the same goals.
For generations, the root of many problems for women could be traced to their education. Feminists recognized that the educational system had been failing girls.
Title IX was passed in 1972. It was one of the early victories of the women's movement.
Many people think Title IX was only about sports. It went much further.
Title IX provides equal educational opportunity for boys and girls in our schools. And it prevents discrimination, which is generally discrimination against girls.
Michigan's Project on Equal Education Rights, the PEER Project, worked with parents, educators, and community members on the implementation of Title IX. During the Milliken and Blanchard administrations, their work opened up educational opportunities in all fields for women and girls.
A lot of people just have no idea how much work has been put into the idea of equal education for boys and girls.
Although much of their gains were rolled back while John Engler was governor, Governor Granholm has initiated efforts to reinstate equal educational opportunities for girls and women. While feminists were addressing educational disparities, they were also looking at inequality in the workplace.
There were many jobs in the past that women could not attain because of societal issues or pressures that kept them out of that.
This was clearly spelled out in the want ads.
One of the things that people don't realize today is during the 70s and 80s, the primary source for information about jobs was the want ads, the classified section of the newspaper. What would happen is they were classified by gender.
But none of the good paying jobs ended up under female help wanted. They were all under the male.
Help wanted female meant bookkeeper, secretary, social worker, librarian, teacher. That was it. That was all that was there. The National Organization for Women lobbied and confronted newspapers who had their ads segregated into help wanted female, help wanted male.
One day on my lunch hour, I thought, I got 20 minutes. I'll just make a couple of phone calls. I talked to I think it was the publisher of the Oakland Press. And I went into my little spiel that I was going to give him, how things were not fair and how I wanted him to change things. and change the column headings. And after I'm through talking, up about 5 minutes, I'm talking, and he's just holding the phone. So he said, okay. I said, pardon me? What was that? He said, okay. I said, it was that easy? He said, nobody ever asked me before.
Many other things had to change for women. Members of the Employment Committee of the National Organization for Women in Detroit decided to form New Options Personnel.
The large corporations were looking for women at that time because 1973 was the beginning of affirmative action. That was the executive order. And it differentiated from the civil rights movement. That meant that any company who had a federal contract had to show good faith in hiring women and minorities.
There were hardly any women who were engineers, although there were women who were educated to be engineers. And the big three gave us job orders.
They wanted numbers, they wanted quotas. That's what corporations do. That's how they deal very well with numbers.
There was also a push to find jobs for women in a wide range of places where women had never worked.
We had a woman that was the very first woman who ever was in the paint area of Cadillac Motor Company. We had women who learned to be truck drivers, and these women who were 5'4", who were driving semis. Women were in all different kinds of industrial plants because that's where the jobs were.
And that's when we got lower down in the organization talking to personnel. And although the managers and the CEOs and everything realized they had to have women, the people that were to execute that resisted us at every turn.
Women sometimes had to take their employers to court to secure their rights. One major case involved Michigan Bell.
One day, one of the engineers came and said that he knew one or two of the offices where they had men doing the job, and the men were being paid considerably more than we were.
Legally, employers aren't allowed to simply change the title of a job in order to pay men more. But this was standard operating procedure at the time.
I had gone to the National Organization for Women. I'd gone to a couple meetings, which got the fires going a little bit as to whether I was going to pursue this or not.
Several other women joined in the case. They went to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, in 1973.
They made the determination that yes, we were right, and in our silly belief, we thought EEOC would help us. Well, they waited about another year or so after they made the determination that we were correct. And then they said, well, we're not going to do anything for you, but if you would like to, we'll give you a letter that says you now have the right to sue.
They turned to one of the growing number of women attorneys.
I contacted the legal counsel for the Detroit chapter of NOW, and she recommended an attorney for us. Jessica Cooper, who is now a judge, told us it would take a while for the lawsuit to be completed. In our imagination, we thought 6 months, we're sure that's all that it's going to take. We'll be sitting there with better pay. We'll have everything the way we want it to be.
It took a lot longer to settle, and because it became a class action suit, the number of people involved grew. Finally, the chief judge in federal court decided the case had gone on long enough.
The day that we all came in there, he stood up by his bench, and he went like this to the attorneys, and they all went into his chambers. And what he told them was, go out there and settle this case today.
After 11 and a half years, the 13 women in the class action suit were offered $2.5 million. They were advised to take it, or Michigan Bell would postpone and postpone as long as they could. They might never see any money. They decided to settle. They had accomplished something even more important to them than winning the lawsuit.
We changed the way the company looked at women. We changed their opportunities. And that was important, because when you figure a company like Michigan Bell that probably had about 60% of their employees were women, they weren't really being fair. I thought that was good. I felt I did my part.
Women faced other challenges in the workplace. Not many people talked about it, and there really hadn't been a term for it. It's what we know today as sexual harassment. Attorney Alan Ravitz was involved in one of the first sexual harassment trials in the country.
A woman came to me. Her name was Fayette Nail. She was a probationary worker at Ford Motor Company, and her husband, who was her childhood sweetheart, was working at the same plant that she was a probationary employee at. They were such innocents, the two of them.
Their innocence was soon replaced with fear and intimidation.
She ran into a foreman who decided that he wanted to make her life miserable and be sexual with her. And he gave her a tough time. And when she didn't want to do anything with him and kept refusing his advances, he would change her shift and make it more difficult, or he'd put her on another line that she'd have more work to do, or he'd find ways to punish her. And finally he said, either use the F word or you'll find yourself out on 23 Mile Road, which was where the plant that she was working.
Sexual harassment was a new concept, and judges and juries weren't likely to understand the issues or be sympathetic.
The case was assigned to a judge who was extremely biased and laughed at the whole issue of sexual harassment. He said, "Look at that guy over there, you should call him as a witness." And I said, "Well, who's that?" He says, "He's a stud. He's one of our prosecutors, but he's a real stud."
Ravitz successfully argued that the judge was biased, and he removed himself from the case. They went to trial with a new judge. Nail versus Ford Motor Company was decided in 1980, 4 years after it was filed. The Nails were awarded damages, and the case broke new ground in the field of sexual harassment.
And when we won, my client said to the press that had been covering us and making jokes, but now they weren't making jokes anymore, she said, "It's not the money, it's the vindication." And every single client that I represented after that in any discrimination case, that is exactly the way they all felt.
Stories like these reminded them of the difficulty of convincing people of the obvious, like the need for women to have credit in their own name, a right taken for granted today.
One of the things I think young people don't realize is the importance that we got through of getting your own credit. Because they just assume that they can get credit. And you know, at our time, we had to get credit to our husband.
The minute I got married, we had one credit card and it had his name, not mine. And I thought, what happened to me? I got married. Was I erased from civilization?
Yeah. I remember interviewing bankers, and their attitude was absolutely astounding. Why would you need credit in your own name? You're married, you know, who do you think you are sort of attitude.
That was a real sore point for an awful lot of women. And it was one that was taken up early on, and we had a victory there. and we were able to get women credit in their own names.
While urging local banks and stores to change their policies, 2 Detroit area women, Joanne Parent and Valerie Angers, decided to take matters into their own hands.
The Feminist Federal Credit Union was the first women's credit union in the world. And it was started in Detroit by these 2 women. And within a year, we had many loans out. We had $250,000 in loans out. And the default rate was minuscule. In fact, I was just saying, I could remember a default.
Well, the first loan I ever got was from Feminist Federal. Yes, and I was working at Hudson's at the time, and I had no credit, and I applied for a $600 loan to buy an old clunker car. But the car only cost $400. The other $200 was to initiate a divorce.
And we were able to use the record of the Feminist Federal Credit Union as a tool to convince the Michigan legislature to pass an act prohibiting discrimination against women in the field of credit.
We could finally prove that we were people in our own right, that we weren't an appendage of some man, that we were adults. We were actual grown-ups. We could have credit in our own name, never mind that we were in our 30s and 40s.
But there were still more barriers to self-sufficiency for women, especially child care.
I saw that as a feminist issue because I think that the community has a responsibility, just as they have a responsibility for schooling.
Because when you're employed and you don't have child care and the pay you're getting is not very good, you really need help. And so we were looking for help from the state and federal government to provide child care to women who needed the help economically so that they could work.
I remember our child care committee, which was about 8 women, and we wrote legislation, we passed legislation, and people said, "How many people are there?" I said, "Oh, hundreds." I said, "We have hundreds." I mean, we did, but not in our committee. We just evoked this image that we could do it, and we did do it, and that's why I think people responded to us.
And because we were so successful, we were very empowered, and people regarded us with a lot of respect. People who would not have otherwise been supported believed we had huge numbers.
There were no odds that we allowed to deter us. We just took it as a challenge, right? And the more people said, "No, you can't do this," the more we said, "But we're planning to do it."
I could go in and launch a campaign against, whatever entity that we decided that we needed to confront, because there wasn't anybody else doing it, and we just made it up, and we supported each other in doing that. And so we learned, I think, to be leaders.
In October of 1975, Detroit area feminists launched a campaign against the Detroit Athletic Club because of its policy denying women membership and not allowing female guests to enter through the front door.
The Detroit Athletic Club's membership was always seen as the power brokers of the metropolitan Detroit area and probably Michigan.
A lot of the women lawyers, the women salespersons, really needed to have lunch there to be able to be part of what went on. That's where the deals were, and we were outsiders.
It was the doors to power, and women were coming in the sideways.
A protest was triggered when Detroit City Councilwoman Mary Ann Mahaffey was barred from admittance when she refused to use the women's entrance, the side door.
"You got to go to the women's entrance." And I said, "No. I'm not going to any women's entrance. I go to the main entrance or not at all."
A group of Detroit area feminists decided to march through the front doors of the DAC.
A group of us formed at the door of the DAC, including Mary Ann and some other people from the chapter, and we started to go in. All of these Men who were lunching were standing there aghast.
It was like something out of a British, an evil and law novel, because there was one man reading his paper with a cigar, and he opened his mouth and the cigar fell right in his lap.
And so I sang I Am Woman at the top of the stairs of the Detroit Athletic Club, because then it gave us something to march out on. You know, it was a good ending.
In early 1986, the men of the DAC voted once again to deny women access.
Sexism is alive and well in the United States and apparently thriving at the Detroit Athletic Club.
We better take a look at what they do in some other cities where they outright have ordinances that ban discrimination, including in private clubs.
To heighten that media attention and to also make the board of directors of the Detroit Athletic Club think again about what their actions were. We had a shoe in.
We put the word out to women across the city and the area. We were collecting high heels.
I contributed a few pair, and I thought it was absolutely fabulous.
We had a truck, and we all loaded our high heels in it, and we took it down to the front of the DAC and dumped them on the front door and said, with big placards, and said, "The real heels are inside." And of course we had a resolution, I'm sure.
The resolution ended with an admonition to the men inside. Remember the poor, bared souls that have been heaped before you. Watch your steps in the future as you bear witness to the unlacing of angry spirits who have publicly curbed and cast aside all comfort in the cause of fairness and equality.
And the press that followed was wonderful. And the DAC people got nervous.
If you had that much public opinion and pressure placed on the people who are supposed to represent the community and who are in high places in corporations, then they will change their minds, and they did.
While some men had the DAC, women had their own club, the Woodbridge Tavern.
It was remarkable to see the difference between that all-male bastion and the complete opposite that would happen at the Woodbridge Tavern, that was men and women and young and old, and it was brilliant and beautiful in its different colors and different things that we all believed in.
Marcia Cron took over the Woodbridge Tavern, now called the Stinky Rose, at a time when many women didn't feel comfortable going to bars alone. Its entertainment soon became the talk of the town.
I had asked Jerry Behrens if she would be interested in singing in the bar, and she said, "What, me sing in a bar?"
And I said to her, in my terribly uppity way, that I didn't sing in bars. I had done musical theater, and that I wasn't going to do singing in a bar, but that I'd come down and see what it was all about.
Well, she did, and what happened is it just skyrocketed.
So we started singing one night, and I don't think I stopped that entire night, and it was so much fun that I did it for 9 years.
Everyone brought friends, and it got to the point we had lines out the door, and it was wild and crazy, and Jerry would sing.
I can remember being at the Woodbridge, and we would start singing I Am Woman, and we would hold up candles, and we'd stand on tables, and we'd dance around the room.
Helen Reddy's version of I Am Woman, which sounded really sort of pleasant and nice, got turned into a rally song because really the words are words that you can have some strength and vehemence behind. It's I am woman, hear me roar. It's not I am woman, hear me roar. It's I am woman, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore.
The Woodbridge was where the political and social converged for us.
almost any feminist you can think of that was in the city came to the Woodbridge. There were always political figures, and if we could possibly have fundraisers for her or him, we did.
The Woodbridge became a power base for us. We had fundraisers for candidates who supported our issues, who cared about our issues.
One of the issues Michigan feminists cared deeply about was the right to choose abortion. It was a constant battle. In 1969, as the Michigan Senate debated legalizing abortion, the only female senator, Lorraine Beebe, shocked her colleagues when she said she'd had a legal therapeutic abortion. She wasn't reelected.
And when I said that, when I said I had, you could have dropped a penny. You could have dropped a pin. And then the press was in there, and then there was a big racket outside. The cameras were being rolled in. They wanted to get because this was a big break.
At that time, it wasn't easy for women to find doctors who would perform legal therapeutic abortions, and illegal abortions weren't always safe.
There isn't a woman my age who doesn't know somebody who had an experience with either an illegal or self-induced abortion. We all know people. We remember it. And for many of us, that's why that issue became so important to us.
Before abortion was legalized, a very good friend, newly divorced, young as I was then, became pregnant and simply did not feel that she could carry a child to term or wanted to or was able to. Found someone who directed her to a back alley operation in Detroit, had the abortion, had terrible physical problems afterward from infection and recuperation, weeks, and was never able to have children as a result. And I never, even in my whole educated life, thought about the issue of abortion up to that point. And suddenly, it was a real pressing, passionate issue, and has been ever since. This is simply an issue of such complexity and differing opinion that the only way to resolve it is to have choice on who makes the decision.
The abortion debate changed on January 22, 1973, when the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. But it didn't end the struggle.
Almost immediately after Roe v. Wade was decided, the opposition started organizing. And they continued to organize. And they knew they couldn't overturn Roe. They couldn't get it overturned. The strategy became to reduce the number of people who could access abortions.
They immediately tried to cut off all the funding for Medicaid abortion. And Governor Milliken and Helen Milliken were there, and the governor, on that basis that you cannot discriminate on the basis of economics, would always veto those bills. And fortunately, at that time, there was not a 2/3 majority to override Governor Milliken.
Eventually, opponents of abortion succeeded in getting legislation passed limiting women's access with restrictions like banning Medicaid funding for indigent women and requiring waiting periods, parental consent, and informed consent for pregnant women and teens. The opposition grew more intense. They launched a campaign of intimidation. They harassed women seeking abortions. They barricaded clinic doors. Anti-choice forces picketed doctors' and employees' homes. In 1986, Kalamazoo Planned Parenthood was burned to the ground. Attacks on clinics and women seeking abortions continued.
In our state, the forces who have been against the right to abortion have been very strong and very powerful. If it wasn't for Roe versus Wade, we wouldn't have the opportunity for abortion. They have presented it as if it was a horrible thing that is being done.
Abortion has existed for thousands of years, from the earliest civilization, when women realized they could not support or raise a family, and those conditions exist now. They did whatever they had to do to terminate a pregnancy, and they still will.
While Michigan feminists worked on a full range of local issues, in 1976 they signed on to the national campaign to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment.
Women are not included in the Constitution of the United States. That is an incredible oversight. We wanted to change that. We wanted the Equal Rights Amendment, which says, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex.
This is a fundamental value in America about treating men and women the same, about making sure that doors of opportunity and that our laws affect men and women the same.
It's an issue that matters because it has to do with how attorneys argue for your rights. And we as women have been shortchanged in that matter.
First introduced in 1923, the ERA was finally passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification in 1972, thanks to Michigan Congresswoman Martha Griffiths.
In '72, Martha Griffith called me and asked me if I would work with her for Michigan. I said, absolutely.
Then we had a wonderful coalition of organizations in our state who had been working on many issues together, and so we were able to move right in and pass it.
Helen Milliken helped organize ER America in Michigan. But there was vocal opposition using some of the same arguments that had been used in the fight against women's suffrage.
The opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment said, oh, first of all, it will destroy the family.
And I would be saying, well, we love our homes, we love our families. That is not going to be an outcome.
And it's because of these bizarre stories that were told about what would happen if the Equal Rights Amendment passed, that women and men would have to share bathrooms, that, I mean, it was just silliness.
I remember one which said that the ERA would lead to an AIDS epidemic. And this would allow the communists to take over the United States. And the thin line of logic in this brochure is that it was going to force the hiring of gay male waiters in restaurants with AIDS, who are then going to infect the American population.
Former Michigan Governor George Romney contributed to the misinformation when he said that the ERA was backed by lesbians, homosexuals, and other moral perverts.
But it was this kind of lunacy that we were encountering. And of course, it was lunacy with a purpose, which was to whip up people's fears, to whip up hysteria against a really basic issue of social equity, and to use it against politicians who were voting in our favor to unseat them for, I think, quite other reasons.
Polls showed that 80% of the American public supported the ERA and only 20% were opposed.
The 20% were very powerful and very, very well heeled. The insurance companies really spent a lot of money on that because of what they would lose if women were equal.
Patricia Hill Burnett was often asked to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment to groups of corporate leaders.
And they said, do you realize that if this Equal Rights Amendment goes through, that we will have to pay you women exactly what we pay men? That would cost billions of dollars for all these businesses across the country, especially for the automobile company. And I said, yes, I know. And they said, do you think for a minute we're going to support you?
We also live in a world that's torn by a great moral struggle between democracy and its enemies, between the spirit of freedom and those who fear freedom.
The political tide started to turn in 1980 when Ronald Reagan won the nomination and the Republican Party removed the Equal Rights Amendment from its platform.
Acquiring what can only be considered
The loss of broad bipartisan support for the ERA meant that state legislatures in unratified states no longer felt the pressure to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA died at midnight, June 30th, 1982, the deadline for ratification.
Well, I thought the ultimate failure was so crushing.
It was hard to believe that justice would not prevail. And it made you feel the whole impact of the whole women's movement, how the workers for suffrage must have felt when they had labored for how long, 80 years, 100 years, for the vote, just the simple vote.
And I think that was very, obviously very, very disappointing to all of us at the time. I think that right now we find ourselves in a position of not only moving forward, but making sure we're not losing the gains that we do have.
The defeat of the ERA and the ongoing struggle to preserve hard-earned gains convinced feminists that they needed to elect more women.
The legislatures are still controlled by men, and men basically are opposed to giving women their rights.
We have been begging men for our rights, lo, these many years. The National Organization for Women has stated that we will not seriously consider reintroduction of the Equal Rights Amendment until women are more represented in the houses and the legislatures across this country, so that we are no
It was
longer
clear to us
begging
that
men
we had to exercise the power of our vote, that we had to do what was the hope of the suffragists, to really have women using their votes in their own best interests. So that's what we decided to do. That's the direction we thought we should be moving in.
The groundwork got laid and the foundation got laid so that women got some support too. They knew that if they ran, we were going to be there to help them.
They say women don't help each other. Oh, yes, they do. Yes, they do. Women promote other women in corporations. Women legislators will hear and nod and say, that happened to me too.
If you want to change the world, if you see things that are unjust, you've got to be in office to do something about it. The analogy that I like to use, you can be on the balcony or you can be on the dance floor, but it's on the dance floor where the moves are happening, and you've got to be on the dance floor if you want to make change.
I mean, if we are not at the table, if our values, our experiences, our perspectives are not at the decision-making tables, then the right decisions won't get made.
Michigan women like Olga Madar and Millie Jeffrey and other union women had been encouraging and supporting women candidates for many years.
When Millie Jeffries called me the second time and said, Irma, you got to run for city council for the women of the city, the state, nation's sake. You got to do it because women are trying to break through.
Jean King and Olga Madar were my mentors, as well as Millie. We had already supported Irma Henderson, the first black woman to serve on council, who was elected in 72. And that was a huge victory. And then Olga decided the time had come for a second woman. And I was lucky enough to be the chosen.
Groups like the National Women's Political Caucus, the Women's Campaign Fund, and NOW's Political Action Committee helped many women candidates.
We tried to learn to raise money, which women at first were just not good at, and husbands don't always want to write a check for their wives or something of that, you know, and single women often didn't have the money. But gradually, I think they've learned.
Over the last a couple of decades, we also have more organized efforts supporting women. There are so many groups that have joined together.
In practical political terms, we work hard at recruiting women candidates, at training women candidates, and then we work at how you get elected and provide monies and technical assistance.
Millie Jeffrey inspired Governor Jennifer Granholm.
She really blew into me the notion that it was not just possible, but that we have an obligation to move the ball forward with respect to women in positions of authority.
And you know, I think back to Susan B. Anthony, who did all these things that women never did in that day and age. Spoke in public, traveled alone in public, agitated for political processes, voted. She was thrown in jail for voting, but she did vote. But she said women have to learn that the important thing in politics is not to be so immersed in the political parties, to follow the candidate that expresses their goals and needs.
It's been more than 150 years since women began sacrificing body and spirit to the cause of women's equality and justice. Great strides have been made, yet so much more remains to be done.
I want people who care to know that the women's fight goes on, you know? And just like we couldn't lose the battle with other people, you know, we always think we won the battle, but we haven't won it unless we stay vigilant.
They just better, or they're going to find that glass ceiling is going to get lower and lower and lower if they don't keep fighting.
I would hope that the next generation would continue the fight for equality, would continue the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, would continue the fight to end poverty and racism and sexism and homophobia. There's so much left to be done.
It's not going to be easy. We have been losing some of the gains we've made, and that unless they are willing to start devoting themselves with greater dedication to the causes of equality, not just for themselves, but for everyone, then we're in trouble in this country.
So the third wave's challenge, I think, is to stand firm and to resist fear, which is so easy to appeal to in the human psyche, and just to kind of reground ourselves, I think, in a deep spiritual belief that all people are created equal.
The struggle is hard at times, but it has its rewards.
Just being involved with women's issues and women's groups was a marvelous part of that whole political experience. Anyone who's never experienced it has lost out.
I should say I feel very, very privileged. I've had wonderful mentors, wonderful experiences. Haven't made any money, but I've had a very fulfilling life.
You know, I gained skills I would have never had. I became a leader in areas that I never thought I would. I formed friendships and partnerships with people that are just the best people in the entire world, as far as I'm concerned. And then there is the universal part, which has to do with what we did to change society. Economically, socially, culturally, politically, we changed American society. And that is a grand reward.